So let's talk now about museum spaces today, because as we've seen, the digital narratives have been kind of developed more and more, and the digital storytelling has been developed, but they have to come and integrate themselves within the museum spaces. So we talked earlier about the traditional venues and spaces of exhibition. We talked about the intimate, so those private collection, the institutional, which is the more kind of national museum types of institution, the rebellious, which is kind of more artist-driven. Those spaces, I think everybody knows, and we've already explored a little bit how storytelling is integrated in that space through various exhibition strategies. What's interesting for us today is that there are now alternative venues. For example, reused spaces, especially post-industrial spaces, seem to be used more and more. So it's the white cube. So are artist studios in public spaces, exhibition in train stations, for example. And of course the digital. But you see that the digital as a museum venue or as a museum tool is an end to all those other alternative venues that we can see being used today. What they all have in common is an inherent multimodality. All of them talk to audiences. All of them convey their stories through various modality. So it can be through images, it can be through the way in which paintings are hanged, it can be through exhibition scenographic choices, it can be the architecture, the building, it can be the labels, it can be the audio guides, it can be integrated videos, it can be all kinds of things, and people, of course. So there are inherently within the museum space this multimodality in terms of narratives, and that's why narratives and storytelling in museum is so interesting. It's because of that weaving of various ways in which the museum communicates with its audience. So we've discussed how learning has changed in museum, has expanded from a purely cognitive knowledge to including affective knowledge, psychomotor knowledge, social learning, and all kinds of skills that come along with it. We've also already discussed a little bit Hein's model of educational theory with its two axes on theory of knowledge and theory of learning, and how those four models of museums, didactic, expository, discovery, stimulus response, and constructivism have been kind of integrated. What I wanted to discuss a little bit more now is how those spaces impact on the ability of a museum to tell their stories. So and how does those decisions in terms of learning theory and theory of knowledge impact on the kinds of tools that can be used, but also the kinds of stories that can be told. So for example, so I've tried to give you examples of each of the various the four models to keep it as concrete as possible, and also trying to link the way in which the story is told with the kinds of knowledge that is being created by the audience in the space. So first we are going to look at the didactic expository. As I said, this is by and large the most common way in which museums approach their audience and their storytelling. They have information they want to pass on to audiences, and they're going to build it block by block in their exhibition spaces in order to convey that information. So for example, here I've taken the Centre Pompidou modern collection exhibition from 1905 to 1965. It works in a very traditional way. It is presenting various aspects of modernism, but mostly basing itself on chronology and geography. And as we've seen, that's a fairly standard way that institutional knowledge is passed on to those audiences. So the way in which the story is told then is mostly through the hanging, so the grouping of artworks, through labels and wall texts, and through audio guides and catalogs. So the weight here is on cognitive knowledge, and that's something that's interesting in that kind of didactic expository models. That's very good at passing a single story, at passing those grand narratives of art history or history that we've talked about earlier. It is very good at passing on cognitive normative information, so factual information about artworks, artists, art movement, the social and artistic context, and it's excellent for anything that has to do with recognition skills. It sometimes carries emotional information, but you can see that that's not the main, the strength of that model, and certainly not when coupled with the kind of standard space. The second model, the stimulus-response model, is much more seen in natural history museums. The principle here, and here you see a photograph from an exhibition from 1993 in the Art Gallery of Ontario, where they had created an audio guide that was not full of information, as you would expect, but rather that was asking questions to the visitors, to prompt them to look further, to prompt them to project themselves in the painting, to spend more time with the painting. You see that that's an exhibition strategy that cannot work without the multimodal, that cannot work without the meeting of several ways of telling the story. And in that particular case, the reading, for example, would have interrupted the capacity for looking. So this kind of combination of audio and visual really helps carry that idea of the stimulus response. So what is it good for? Well, it's very good for emotional knowledge, because at an individual level, it stimulates imagination and creativity. If you're asked to try and imagine how it would feel to be walking in that forest, for example. And it is very important in terms of personal identity development, because it helps with the projection and the building of the self. It's also very good in terms of social knowledge, because it creates empathy, and it's very good at sharpening people's tools to communicate their emotion in particular. So you see that the stimulus response model is a model that inherently necessitates a more elaborate assemblage of various mediums to be able to communicate its story, to be able to convey its story. The discovery model is still fairly rare in art exhibition. You find it a lot again in science museums. And here you have an example of an art exhibition from 2012, which was called Art Turning Left. And the whole structure of the exhibition was built around questions. And here you see a room that was quite central in the exhibition design, where people would ask questions, answer questions, comment on artworks, etc. It became a sort of forum of shared knowledge by the visitors. So you see that space does not look like an exhibition space, because the knowledge is then being constructed, like learners are constructing their knowledge. So even though that knowledge exists outside of the learner, and there's a need to kind of gather that knowledge and kind of regroup it, it is the job of the learners to construct the knowledge, to rebuild it, the visitors. And so that means, in terms of storytelling, that you're going to have lots of bits and pieces, like almost like a puzzle game, like like a treasure hunt, where you're going to try and put back together those bits of knowledge. And that is also where the digital storytelling is stronger than the in-space storytelling. In-space storytelling tends to limit the access to that knowledge that exists outside the learner, whereas the digital storytelling allows for a truly networked construction of knowledge. So what does it do? What is it good for? Well, it's very good for cognitive knowledge and skills. It's very good for emotional knowledge and skills. And it's very good for social knowledge and skills. So you see that you have a model here that is actually more productive in terms of visitors' learning than, for example, the didactic model, which again is very strong in cognitive, but that's what it's mostly good at. So finally, the fourth model by Hein is constructivism. And you see again a space that looks more like a storage room or a lab than it looks like an exhibition space. So with constructivism, the idea is that the learner constructs their knowledge and that all knowledge is constructed by the learner socially or personally. And here you have something the Van Abbe did that was called the DIY archive, where you had on one side a whole lot of original works that were in kind of storage drawer, like not drawers, but like shelves. And audiences could just come and look for the works that they wanted to group together and exhibit them as a group, and then they would discuss it with people present. They would kind of look for more information. They would also enter, look at the works closely, and enter kind of like the logic behind their groupings. So you see here you have again a very different necessity when it comes to storytelling, because the story is actually generated by the visitors themselves, and it's about archiving those stories, it's about making those stories social. And that's again where the digital storytelling comes in and really allows for an expansion of the physical space. So what's the constructivist model good for? Well, it's very good for cognitive, analytical, critical networking and factual learning, because you have to recognize what you're hanging, for example. It's good for emotional knowledge because it tends to create a sense of ownership of the work by the audience. And it's very good for imagination, creativity, empathy, and all those layers of identity we were talking about earlier. It is also good for psychomotor learning, and you've seen that there's very few models that are actually good for that, because people are handling artworks, they're displaying the artworks, so they're learning all kinds of things related to movement. And it's excellent for social learning because they are creating those communication skills. They have to explain the reasons behind their choices. So what we see, and I hope that I've convinced you, that the space itself is never singular. Spaces often have very many potentials, and many spaces can be created within an exhibition space to be able to create and to be able to create a curatorial strategy, what kind of spaces we want to create in terms of museum storytelling. We also need to have in mind what kind of engagement we want from our audiences, what kind of strategy do we want to approach, how do we want to approach that audience. And from those two things, this curatorial strategy and engagement strategy that goes hand in hand, the type of narrative, the type of storytelling suitable in order to kind of pass on to achieve those goals will be deducted. And from there also, which tools are going to be used? Are we going to stay purely in space? Are we going to have workshops? Are we going to have people talking? Are we going to have multimedia guides? Are we going to have a digital extension? All those things are actually driven by a curatorial strategy that goes hand in hand with an engagement strategy. Thank you.